There is a dark passage in Genesis that modern theology has tried to soften for thousands of years of history. It is about 4 disturbing verses that narrate a forbidden and scandalous union between the divine and the earthly. Most people read the Bible without stopping to question the true nature of these mysterious beings. However, the original Hebrew texts suggest a reality much more complex than a simple moral allegory. Who were really the sons of God who decided to abandon their celestial dwelling to take human wives? The answer to this question could radically change our understanding of the origin of evil in the world. For centuries, scholars and archaeologists have debated the identity of these beings and their offspring. What you're about to discover is not a simple legend, but the fragment of a history censored by time. To understand this enigma, we must travel to the dawn of humanity, when heaven and earth were connected. The biblical account begins by stating that men had begun to multiply upon the face of the earth. It was at that precise moment when the sons of God observed that the daughters of men were beautiful and desirable. The phrase used in the original Hebrew text is bene, Elohim, a term that denotes a direct creation of the divinity. In the Old Testament, this designation is used almost exclusively to refer to angels or celestial beings. This immediately rules out the modern idea that they were simply pious men of the lineage of Seth. The oldest and most literal interpretation suggests that we are facing an incursion of spiritual entities into the physical world. The Book of Job uses exactly the same term to describe the angels who appear before the divine throne. Therefore, the text suggests that beings from another dimension transgressed a fundamental cosmic law to become flesh. This transgression was not a simple sin of lust, but a calculated rebellion against the order established by the Creator. By taking human form, these beings renounced their state of grace to experience the forbidden pleasures of matter. But the story becomes even darker when we analyze the direct consequences of these unnatural unions. The product of this mixture between the celestial and the human were not normal children, but a hybrid and powerful race. Genesis calls them the Nephilim, a word that has been translated wrongly many times, simply as giants. However, the etymological root of the word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew verb naphal, which means to fall or the fallen. They were the fallen, those who descended with force to tyrannize ancient humanity with their supernatural power. Ancient Jewish traditions, preserved in texts outside the biblical canon, offer chilling details about them. The Book of Enoch, a text revered by the early church, expands this narrative with almost surgical precision. Enoch describes a group of 200 angels, known as the Watchers, who swore to fulfill this forbidden pact. According to this apocryphal account, they descended upon the summit of Mount Hermon, a geographical location that still exists today. Their leader, an entity called Semyaza, feared that his subordinates would not have the courage to consummate the final act, but all of them united with human women. Teaching them secrets that humanity was not prepared to know, they revealed the art of war, metallurgy, sorcery, and the use of cosmetics for seduction and deception. It was a total corruption of knowledge, giving technology and magic to a civilization that was still in its infancy. The appearance of the Nephilim marked the beginning of an era of violence and absolute chaos that the earth had never witnessed. These hybrid beings possessed immense strength and an insatiable appetite that ended up consuming all resources. When the earth's food ran out, ancient texts state that they began to devour humans themselves. The earth was filled with blood and clamor, causing divine justice to have to intervene in a drastic and final manner. This narrative explains why the universal flood was not just a punishment for sin, but a necessary genetic purge. The human bloodline had been irremediably contaminated by the intrusion of this DNA alien to our nature. Noah was chosen not only for his morality, but because he was perfect in his generations, that is, genetically pure. But the theory of the fallen angels is not the only explanation that historians have considered over the centuries. During the Middle Ages, the Church tried to rationalize this myth to eliminate the uncomfortable idea of angels with physical bodies. The theory of lineages emerged, which proposed that the sons of God were simply the righteous descendants of Seth. According to this view, the daughters of men were the descendants of the cursed and violent lineage of Cain. The first murderer, St. Augustine, was one of the main defenders of this position. Trying to eliminate the supernatural element from the story, they argued that angels, being pure spirits, do not possess the biological capacity to reproduce with women. However, this theological explanation deliberately ignores the specific linguistic use of the term B'nai Elohim. Furthermore, it does not explain how the union of 2 normal human lineages could produce an offspring of powerful giants. Biology tells us that the union of a believer with a non-believer produces a normal child, not a Superman of 3 meters. Therefore, the Seth lineage theory leaves too many loose ends and contradictions that the biblical text does not resolve. There is a third interpretation that connects this story with the ancient king lists of the Sumerian civilization. In Mesopotamia, ancient kings claimed to be descendants of gods and ruled for impossible periods of time. The Sumerian sages, known as Abgalu, were described as semi-divine beings who brought civilization to man. It is fascinating to note the similarities between the Watchers of the Book of Enoch and the Apkallu of Mesopotamian mythology. Both groups are described as teachers who brought advanced knowledge and mixed with the human population. This suggests that the Genesis account could be a theological polemic against the beliefs of neighboring nations. While the Sumerians venerated these hybrid beings as heroes, the Bible presents them as monsters and transgressors. The so-called heroes of antiquity, men of renown, were not role models, but tyrants who had to be destroyed. Archaeology has found figurines and texts throughout the region that demonstrate the obsession with divine hybridization. The concept of god-kings was the basis of political authority in almost all civilizations of the ancient world. From the pharaohs of Egypt to the emperors of Rome, everyone claimed to have a spark of divinity in their blood. But the Genesis account dismantles this pretension, showing that such a mixture is an abomination that leads to death. Returning to the text, the divine sentence against this corruption was to limit man's life to 120 years. This drastic reduction in human longevity marks the end of the mythic era and the beginning of mortal history. There would no longer be beings who lived for almost a millennium accumulating power and knowledge indefinitely on earth. The mystery deepens when we read that the Nephilim also existed after the flood, according to the Book of Numbers. This has led many researchers to wonder if the genetic incursion occurred more than once in history. When the Israelite spies explored the land of Canaan, they reported seeing giants that made them feel like grasshoppers. These clans of giants, such as the Anakim, were feared for their ferocity and their connection to the ancient forbidden lineages. Joshua's war for the conquest of the Promised Land can then be read as a war against the hybrid remnants. The order of total extermination, that so shocks modern readers, had the purpose of eradicating that corrupt DNA, Goliath. The Philistine giant who challenged David is presented as one of the last remnants of this ancient lineage. His armor and his stature evoke the technology and power of the ancient watchers who corrupted humanity. But beyond military history, this story tells us of the constant human temptation to be like gods. The search for immortality and absolute power is a recurring theme that connects Eden with the Tower of Babel. The sons of God offered an evolutionary shortcut, a quick knowledge that promised to elevate man above his condition. It is the same pattern that we see in Greek mythology with Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to give it to men, or in the legend of the Titans. Divine beings who rebelled against the Olympian order and were locked in Tartarus. Curiously, the Bible uses the term Tartarus in the New Testament to describe the prison of these fallen angels. The Apostle Peter mentions that God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them into prisons of eternal darkness. Jude, in his epistle, confirms that these angels abandoned their own dignity to go after strange flesh. These references in the New Testament validate the supernatural interpretation that Second Temple Judaism held for the first Christians. The existence of these hostile spiritual powers was a tangible and dangerous reality. They believed that the spirits of the dead Nephilim, being hybrids, could not go to either heaven or hell after dying. According to the tradition of Enoch, these incorporeal spirits became the demons that torment humanity. They desperately seek physical bodies to possess, trying to recover the sensory experience they lost in the flood. This vision offers a coherent explanation for the origin of demons that the Bible distinguishes from fallen angels. The cultural impact of this story resonates even today in our modern narratives about aliens and superheroes. Many ancient astronaut theorists have attempted to reinterpret the sons of God as extraterrestrial visitors. They see in the chariots of fire and in the beings that descend from the sky a primitive description of advanced technology. However, this materialist view ignores the deep spiritual and moral component that permeates the entire biblical text. The story is not about space biology, but about the transgression of the sacred limits imposed by the divinity. It is a warning about what happens when the barriers separating the different planes of existence are broken. The figure of gods turned into humans represents the maximum perversion of the natural order created in the beginning. Instead of man rising toward God through virtue, the divine descends toward man through lust. It is a satanic inversion of the incarnation, where the spirit is made flesh not to save, but to corrupt and dominate. By analyzing the Hebrew text, we find nuances that are lost in conventional translations into modern languages. The word for men in this passage is Adam, referring to humanity in general, not just the lineage of Cain. This reinforces the idea that the crisis was global and affected the entire biological structure of the human species. God's pain, expressed in Genesis upon seeing the evil, is the response to the destruction of his image in man. The forbidden mixture threatened to erase the imago Dei, the image of God, replacing it with the image of the fallen. If the plan of the rebel angels had succeeded, there would have been no pure human being left to bring the Messiah. From this perspective, the account of Genesis 6 becomes the essential prologue to understand the rest of the Bible. It is the explanation of why the ancient world was so saturated with idolatry, magic, and superhuman violence. The gods of the nations that demanded blood sacrifices could be distorted echoes of these historical beings. Mythology, then, would not be pure invention, but the traumatic memory of humanity about these real events. Zeus, Odin, Marduk, And other father gods could have their origin in the memories of the powerful Nephilim leaders, their stories of incest, parricide, and war reflect the chaos that Genesis describes with such sobriety and brevity. The Bible demystifies these beings by stripping them of their glory and showing them as judged cosmic criminals. It is an act of theological resistance to declare that these supposed gods are nothing more than prisoners waiting for their sentence. Upon reading these texts today, we face the discomfort of a world that is much stranger than we admit. We prefer a safe and rational religion, but the Bible presents us with a universe inhabited by complex intelligences. The mystery of the sons of God forces us to reconsider our position in a cosmic hierarchy that we do not see. It reminds us that human history is not a closed system, but a stage open to influences from other worlds. The biblical narrative insists that the doors between dimensions have not always been hermetically closed, and warns that in the final days, the conditions of the world will resemble the days of Noah before the great cataclysm. This prophecy suggests a return of the same dynamics of hybridization and corruption that provoked the ancient judgment. Today, we see how science plays dangerously with genetics, crossing barriers between species in laboratories. The pursuit of transhumanism and artificial biological improvement resonates with the ancient promises of the Watchers. The desire to be more than human, to achieve divinity through technology, is the same ancestral temptation. The story of Genesis 6 is not a literary fossil, but a dark mirror that reflects our own modern ambitions. It challenges us to ask if we are repeating the same mistakes that led to the destruction of the first civilization. The current fascination with contact with non-human intelligences could be a modern version of that ancient error. Opening doors that we do not know how to close has always been the perdition of human curiosity without moral limits. The story ends by leaving an echo of warning that has resonated through the millennia until reaching us today. The identity of the sons of God remains one of the most fascinating and debated enigmas of sacred literature. But whether we see them as angels, kings, or demons, their impact on the collective consciousness is undeniable. They force us to look up and wonder what other secrets are hidden in the abysses of forgotten time. The truth about our past is much more disturbing and extraordinary than any fiction we have invented, in the end. Genesis leaves us with the certainty that we are not alone, but that not all company is benign. The veil between the natural and the supernatural is thinner than our rational mind would like to accept. Understanding this chapter is to possess a master key to decipher the myths of all ancestral cultures. It is the missing piece that connects history, religion, and legends into a single coherent and terrifying narrative. The gods who turned into humans left a trace that not even the flood could completely erase. Their legacy persists in the megalithic ruins and in the stories of giants that populate the folklore of every continent. Recognizing their historical existence is the first step to waking up from the dream of normality in which we live. Reality is much vaster, more dangerous, and fascinating than we have been told in school history books. This mystery, hidden behind the biblical account, invites us to keep our eyes open to the unknown and inexplicable. Subscribe now to unearth more forgotten secrets that official history has preferred to ignore for centuries.